My name is Brad. I'm one of the pastors here at River City. I'm thankful you're with us today. As we're heading into this passage, we're in the book of Ecclesiastes right now. We are in chapter 7, in the thick of it, as they might say. Like, we are at the point in Ecclesiastes where I texted Troy and Rob this week, and I said, whose idea was this and why are we doing this again? Because it just seems like too much, if I'm honest. Like, it's like, man, week after week of this perspective, it can be wearying, and some of these texts are hard to work through. And yet, I feel like I am on this progression every single week with the book of Ecclesiastes, where at the beginning of the week, I feel that way. I complain a lot about what we're doing. I feel like there's not going to be a message this Sunday. And then I sit and I read, and God is faithful that as we dwell on His Word, as we think deeply about it, that He shows us how it is true, and He confirms what we need to hear. And in reading these passages, man, it's been making me think this week about like stuff that I have heard my parents say to me over and over again, and then that makes me reflect on like things that I'm saying to my kids over and over again. So I thought I'd invite you just for a moment, like just think in your head, like what phrases for you when you think about like growing up in your household, or if you have kids and they're getting older and you feel like you're on repeat, like what little things, what little truisms, what little proverbs, if you will, do you feel like you're saying all the time? Just think about it for a moment. And I remember like lots of things my parents would say to me. It made me think even more about like things I say to my kids. I feel like I say to my kids all the time, like, it is what it is, man, right? This is what it is. Or I'll say, in a nice way, usually like, hey man, stuff happens. Sometimes I don't say stuff. But I'll say, hey, things happen sometimes. And I thought, man, you know what I say a lot? A lot of times I tell my kids, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. When somebody cuts their finger, when somebody gets sick, when something gets broken, I feel like I just say, it's going to be okay. But today, the author, the teacher in the book of Ecclesiastes is going to reflect on some things that he heard all the time. He's going to reflect really on proverbs that he had heard throughout his life. Proverbs, many of which I think are actually referenced and contained in the book of Proverbs. Things where he heard things like this. Proverbs 2:12, wisdom will save you from the ways of wicked men. Proverbs 3:5-6, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He'll make your path straight. Proverbs 16:3, commit to the Lord whatever you do, and He will establish your plans. But what the teacher's going to do in this book is, as he turns to think about the Proverbs, he's going to ask this question. What about when it doesn't go that way? Okay? What about when the little truisms, the it's going to be okay, the wisdom will free you from wicked men, the trust in God and your path will be straight. What about when it doesn't feel like that? What about when the things that your mom and dad told you, or the things even coming out of your mouth as a parent, you're like, I'm telling you what I hope, but I'm not sure that it's always true. The author of the Proverbs, the author of Ecclesiastes, truly turns to answer this question: how do we find this good life that he wishes to point us towards, this thing that we all want in a crooked world? And how do we make it when even that good life is hard? And so to that end, I just want to pray one more time before we jump into this passage, because I think, like, as I've read it over and over again, and maybe even as you hear it today, it might for you evoke some of the bad that you feel. It might remind you of some of the ways in which you feel like God's promises don't feel or look the way you thought they would feel or look. And so I want to pray that God would give us, an extra measure of faith, that even when we feel some of those feelings, that He would help us to believe, because we don't believe on our own. We believe as a gift from God. And then second, that we would find peace and comfort in the conclusion of this text today. So let's pray, and then we'll jump into Ecclesiastes chapter 7. Oh, Lord, grant us faith, not just for this moment, Lord, but even as we acknowledge the hardship of living in a world so full of pain, so full of difficulty. God, help us when it feels like your promises aren't coming true. God, help us when we can't find something to cling to. God, offer us peace and comfort. Lord, give us that gift of faith, a good gift from you. to believe, to trust. Even when what's in front of our eyes is confusing and difficult. God, with the very real presence of God, be here with us as we read your word today. With the Holy Spirit, appear, illuminate, and enlighten this text for us. Amen. Ecclesiastes 7, we'll start at verse 1, read through 14 to start. Be on the screen. Feel free to be on your phone or one of these if you picked one up. A good name is better than fine perfume, and the day of one's death is better than the day of one's birth. It is better to go to a house of mourning than go to a house of feasting, since that is the end of all mankind, and the living should take it to heart. Grief is better than laughter, for when a face is sad, a heart may be glad. The heart of the wise is in a house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in a house of pleasure. It is better to listen to a rebuke from a wise person than to listen to the song of fools. For like the cackling of a burning thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of a fool. This too is futile. Surely the practice of exhortation turns a wise person into a fool, and a bribe corrupts the mind. The end of a matter is better than the beginning. A patient spirit is better than a proud spirit. Don't let your spirit rush to be angry, for anger abides in the hearts of fools. Don't say, why were the former days better than these? Since it is not wise of you to ask this. Wisdom is as good as an inheritance and an advantage to those who see the sun. Because wisdom is the protection as silver is protection. But the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of its owner. Consider the work of God, for who can straighten out what he has made crooked? In this day of prosperity be joyful, but in the day of adversity consider God has made the one as well as the other, so that no one can discover anything that will come after him. Now, I know that's a long section, and it jumps a lot. And what we're going to really need to do as we handle this section as a whole is maybe not to handle it in the same way that we would handle like a paragraph in like an epistle that Paul wrote in the New Testament. Maybe not even handle it like we would handle a specific poem or a psalm, but instead we need to kind of take it at the whole and kind of step back for a moment and say, like, what is the author communicating here? What is the teacher in Ecclesiastes, this nameless person? What are they trying to communicate about life and about God? If you notice, this section is filled with kind of this paradoxical irony, right? It's filled with these things that don't feel like they can stand next to each other and be true. Like, what does it mean that it's better to go to a house of mourning, like a funeral home, than to be in a place filled with joy and laughter? What the heck? Like, no, it's not, right? That's what you're supposed to feel when you read this. You're not supposed to act like a good Christian and be like, yes, I see. No, you're supposed to read it and go, nuh-uh. You're supposed to read and go, no, a good name is better than fine perfume. The day of one's death is not better than the day of one's birth. You're supposed to read that and say, like, I don't feel like that's true. Because that tension is the tension that almost all of life exists in, isn't it? The tension of, like, this moment doesn't feel like it should be the moment. Grief is better than laughter, for when a face is sad, a heart might be glad. How so? It's filled with paradoxes. Two things that don't feel like they can be simultaneously true. It's filled with irony, saying that everything that is good is inherently sad. What it's saying is things that we know to be true, but often don't feel true. And so something we're going to have to reckon with as we read this today is, I think, one of the perspectives we're trying to gain as we step back. And remember what we've said about Ecclesiastes, that often what this author is trying to do is not give you an easy pathway to like a term paper on life, but instead to help you feel something that you often avoid feeling. And here's the thing I think that maybe we need to reckon with. That your emotional state will not always act as an accurate gauge of the quality of your life. Emotions are not bad. Now hear me say this. Emotions are not bad. If anything, emotions are neutral. Some emotions might feel bad to experience, but our emotions are a gift to us. And don't hear me say this. I'm not advocating for a life of constant sadness, right? I'm not telling you, and nor is the author of Ecclesiastes trying to point you and say that sadness is actually fun, and all you need to do is unlock the key to how much fun it is to cry. Like, that sounds like a television commercial for something, right, that you shouldn't buy. Okay? That's not what we're getting at. We're not saying that emotions are bad. We're not advocating for sadness. Instead, I think what the teacher is trying to point you towards here is a life that has more perspective than just the temporal perspective of what you can see in front of you in this moment. What really he's drawing this picture of here, this illustration, is that there is no real way to measure empirically in front of us what the quality of one's life is. And so if you read this again, if you were to skim over it, maybe it's worth taking some time this week to spend some time just in this opening kind of proverbial section where he's responding to wisdom that he's heard from the proverb and saying, hey, what about when it doesn't feel like that? Is to kind of see the categories that he draws here. Just a few. The category of health. He talks about the categories of wealth. He talks about intelligence or wisdom. He talks about fame. He talks about all these things that if we're honest, I think we all want and we're seeking, right? But things that are unpredictable, things that we can't seem to grasp and hold on to, they're fleeting. Things that, if we're honest, oftentimes just feel completely outside of our control. Health, for example. I think probably if you're a sports fan at all, or even if you're not, like you saw the news this past week that there was an NFL player named Damar Hamlin who like collapsed on the field after a collision. And I was just thinking about how the stark reality of the fragility of life in this, right? Like you have this guy, peak athletic performance, right? Everything seems to be going his way. Goes through like what honestly, if you've seen like what happened to him before he had this major medical episode, like it just seems like if you watch football, not even that big of a thing, and then he just collapsed on the field. And I think there's still even some questions of exactly what happened and why it happened, but ultimately like his heart stopped and he had to be revived in that moment. And we're thankful that he's doing better now, but what a reminder of the fleeting nature of our body's health. How it can seem like literally in a moment like that, we can go from confidence to fear in our bodies. The author of Ecclesiastes asks us to reckon with that for a minute, for how out of control we are of our very health. He challenges the comfort that we can try and find, the security we can try and find through money and wealth. Now, throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, we are pointed to the fact that the money and wealth and possessions can almost instantly go away. I don't know how many of you were like into econ, but Steve and I are, and so like we can share some podcasts with you. But maybe you've heard about like the most recent like big news in the past 2 months with this guy named Sam Brinkman-Fried, who was this big like crypto maven running this big firm called FTX that literally overnight hundreds of millions and then even billions of dollars of wealth were just erased, right? Just all these people that thought they had invested all this money and they were going to have this quick scheme to get more, and now he's probably going to go to prison and he's broke. Probably still has more money than me, but he's going to be broke, okay? How quickly can wealth leave? When we think about intelligence, we think about how like even we know that I'm going to get called out front row boy here. I enjoy Elon Musk in a lot of ways, but it's been a rough couple months for Elon, right? I don't know how the man gets anything done because he tweets about everything. I told Troy, it would not surprise me if tomorrow morning I got up and like there was a tweet on my account from Elon like, hey, kids are looking really cute these days. Like he's just in everything on there. But man, how fast can someone's perspective on someone's success and the public opinion of somebody who's like, by all means, just more intelligent than the average dude or lady, how quickly can it fall for him in the public opinion? How quick can it feel like, man, if I only was that smart, if I could create this many things, if I could amass this much intelligence, my life would be fine. And then it doesn't matter. I thought about fame this week, and this is not to have like a commentary on the idea of cancel culture, but merely to say like, man, how crazy is it the fear inspired in those whose lives are built on their popularity to think that it could go away in an instant, rightly or wrongly. All this to say, I think the author of Ecclesiastes walks us through several categories of things that if we're honest, we're probably all trying to attain. Like, I think we all want to be healthy. But we want to accumulate wealth. It's nice to have security. We like the idea of nice things. Man, we want to be smart. Like, we want to build our minds. We want to feel like we've got it all figured out. I think if we're honest, like, all of us would love just at least a little bit of fame. Maybe not that everyone would follow us around with cameras, but at least that, like, we feel known and important. The author of Ecclesiastes reminds us that he has literally possessed all these things. He's been called wise. He's had tons of money. He's thrived in his health. He's been famous. And then he writes these proverbs and says, sometimes it all seems like it's going sideways. Over and over again, he reminds us everything is futile. None of it matters because he has attained so many of the things that we want to attain. And his life was still hard. It still was painful. And so it begs the question, how do you evaluate your life? He says this in this section. He says, hey, be careful. He says, don't ask this question, verse 10. He says, don't say, were the former days better than these? He gives us this key tool. He says, when you're thinking about your life, be careful that you don't look at the past and let nostalgia overwhelm you, right? I'm bad at this, right? So Sarah and I, you're going to get excited. We fell in love in Chicago, right? And we didn't just fall in love in Chicago, we fell in love with Chicago, right? And so, like, when I think about memories of that time, like where we met, the streets that we would walk down, the alleys that we would sneak down to just hold hands, like when I think about those memories, when I think about like having our first baby, bringing her home, buying our first like home together, setting up an apartment before that, like, man, I can only think good things about it. We were broke. We're like, why didn't we do more when we lived in the city? It was like, oh, we had no money. Like 80% of our money went to our parking spot, it felt like, just to have a place to put our car. And it was a Sebring. It was a bad car. It didn't deserve that spot. We didn't have a lot of money. We didn't know what we were doing at all, right? Like there was no plan. We were like just looking for the next thing, hoping for the future. But when I think back on it, man, nostalgia overwhelms me, and I think everything was perfect. We're so happy. We were in this awesome place. Everything was going well. And the author of Ecclesiastes encourages us to remember that nostalgia is dangerous. That we can look back and only see the good, and then that can lead us to complain about today. So he says, first of all, be careful when you look back not to remember that every positive memory that you have in your past was also still kind of bathed in the struggle and difficulty of this world. And yet you still have happy memories. Don't just ask if the past was better. Two, he asks us to have a perspective. And in the top 3 verses I was worried about today, this is one of them, so I'll read it again so we can really let it sink in. It says this in verse 13, consider the work of God. Who can straighten out what he has made crooked? And I sent a text to Troy this week and I said, I wonder what I'll say about this, right? That's a difficult verse. Here's what I think the author of Ecclesiastes is trying to call you to. God, in his divine sovereignty that you can't understand. And if you can't come at this with a little bit of humility, man, that's honestly the first step to surrendering to God is humility. Is saying you're in charge and I'm not, and it's good that I'm not in charge, and I'm not smart enough to understand what it means that you're in charge. So the first step is to be a little humble, but to look at the world and say, God has built it this way. God has, in the complexity that exists in, allowed humans to have free will and allowed them to bring sin into this world. And in that, the world has been made crooked. You are living in the upside down, if you will, okay? This is not how it's supposed to be. And so if you have tension over things in your life right now, right? If you feel like something that is happening to you is unjust, if you feel like something today in your life isn't right and isn't the way that it's supposed to be, you're probably right. That we exist in a world corrupted with little pieces of brokenness. Some of them our own doing, right? Like sometimes it's our own failure to follow and to live in the image of God that has been set inside us. And then sometimes it's just the brokenness that the collective nature of sin has even brought into the very like fabric of the world itself, like in the physical, tangible things. So be reminded of this. You exist in a crooked world. things are going to be broken in it. And if you exhaust all of your energy trying to straighten out a world that is broken by sin, you don't have the ability to do so. So he offers this perspective. He says, hey, don't just look at the past and think the past was perfect, because it wasn't. Look at the world and have realistic eyes that understands that there's brokenness that exists in this world that you can't fix. And then verse 14 he says, in the day of prosperity be joyful, but in the day of adversity consider that God has made this one as well as the other, so that no one can discover anything that will come after him. Now this is a somber encouragement that ends this first section. He says, consider the fact that on your good days God is with you, and on your bad days God is with you. Consider the fact that on your good days, on your best days, on your joyful days, where you get to rejoice, God is there. And on your bad days, somehow, God is there. Now, he is not ignorant of the fact that it is going to be hard, if not impossible, for us to perceive God's presence when things are bad. That we, in our human condition, are often blinded by adversity, suffering, and sadness. It can make us forget that God was as present when times were good as he is when times are bad. This is a part of our fallen condition. And so he says, in those good times, even when those good times are interspersed with bad times, enjoy it properly. Take joy in the good times, and in the bad times, fight to remember that God is still in control and that he is the one holding the future. And that's going to be really important as we move into these next sections and try and resolve this. So, what is the good life in a crooked world? That's the question that he's kind of posing here. What is this supposed to be when good things can turn bad, when things are fleeting, when the promises don't seem to come through? How do I keep going is where he's going to go next. How do I keep going in this crooked and broken world? Verse 15. He says, in my futile life I've seen everything. Someone righteous perishes in spite of his righteousness, and someone wicked lives long in spite of his evil. Don't be excessively righteous, and don't be overly wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Don't be excessively wicked, and don't be foolish. Why should you die before your time? It is good that you grasp the one and do not let the other slip from your hand. For the one who fears God will end up with both of them. Wisdom makes the person stronger than 10 rulers of a city. There's certainly no one righteous on earth who does good and never sins. Don't pay attention to everything that people say, or you will hear your servant cursing you. For in your heart you know that many times you yourself have cursed others. How do I keep living in this broken and crooked world? Some odd advice, if we're honest. Here's the principle, I think. Neither righteousness, wisdom, or folly, or sinning will keep you from suffering because of the brokenness of the world. So I think what the author of Ecclesiastes is advocating here is for a balanced perspective of self and a balanced approach to life. Verse 16 is verse number 2 that I was worried about this week, okay? Where he says, don't be excessively righteous. Now, that's a weird verse if you've read much of the Bible, right? I honestly don't know another verse in the Bible that seems to say, don't try to be too good, okay? Don't try too hard, right? And then even the next verse is a little weird, where he says, don't be excessively evil. Maybe a little evil, but don't be excessively evil. What on earth is this verse here, right? I'm just going to read you my notes. 1, you're not as good as you think you are, and you're not as wise as you think you are. You have sin and foolishness that are in play in your life. Even if you don't like it, to know those things are going to be exposing you to the pain of the world. Don't be a dummy, this is what I wrote. Don't be evil, but know that you're a little evil and pretty dumb. Don't run into evil, but do acknowledge that sin and foolishness are in play in your choices to seek wisdom and right living. Avoid burning out just trying to bring unnecessary suffering on yourself. These are my incredibly intelligent, almost unintelligible notes, okay? But we're going to try and work through them. First off, You're not as good as you think you are. That's what I really think he's saying when he says, don't be excessively righteous. What this author is calling you to is reading the Proverbs and thinking, I did all those things, right? That you would read wisdom, that you would read the instruction of God, and you would look at it with a prideful heart that says, I've done it all, right? Or you would stress and think, well, I've done it all, but I haven't done this one thing. And so you would spend your entire life thinking that you are near perfection, that you are pursuing righteousness to a level with your own effort that's impossible. Just don't be excessively righteous. Don't start to think of yourself as so morally upstanding and wise that you are surprised when the stuff that you do doesn't always turn out. This is like beginning of the project syndrome, right? This happened to me yesterday. I said to my daughter, Sarah was running a quick errand, taking Michael to a birthday party. I said, hey, Lucy, see that lamp over there? Let's fix that lamp. It'll just take a minute. It's like, can you go get me the pliers from the garage? I'm going to take it down. This old vintage lamp. She goes, sure, it'll just take a minute. I'll sacrifice some of my Sabbath. This won't be work at all, Dad. You're right. She gets me the pliers. 4 hours later, we repaired the lamp. No joke. I mean, I had to go to the hardware store, made her cry 3 times, if I'm honest, borderline 4, and that was just because I said, don't cry, while holding a soldering iron. Like, it was a good situation. Good situation. Burned a hole through a plastic tray. Everything's going really, really well yesterday, okay? This is the beginning of the project syndrome. Like, that's fine, I got it. It's all going to be good. And then shocked when a part of it goes wrong because I thought I had it. I thought, like, I got all the skills for this. This is going to be an easy fix. I know what's wrong. That was the first big mistake. Didn't know what was wrong. 3 things were wrong. All of them were invisible. Not good. It's the beginning of the project thing. And life can be like that. Like, we can charge into stuff and think, like, yeah, I know life's going to be hard, but like, I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to do all the things right. I'm going to follow every single step. The author of Ecclesiastes warns you against that prideful thinking that says, like, I've got it all figured out. I'm going to be surprised when things don't go well. Now, like I said, be careful, because like not everything that goes wrong is because you did something wrong. Not everything that goes wrong is because you weren't a good enough person. Not everything that goes wrong is your fault. Some of it is just the result of the world that we're in. That's why he says, don't be excessively righteous. Now, why does he say don't be excessively evil? Here's what he's saying. As you realize that you shouldn't pursue excessive righteousness, you're going to be tempted to say, well, I guess nothing I do matters, and you're going to charge into evil. He says, don't face that temptation thinking, well, if I can't ever be perfect, if I try and do the things that God commands me, if I pursue wisdom instead of foolishness, it still all goes to crap. And so you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to live life for today. Carpe diem, baby. Right? And run into evil. And he says, don't do that, because you, and this is not a joke, so you will die. If you run into evil and foolishness, even though you might not always feel like the benefits of righteousness are playing out or that God is on your side as you pursue what he said is best for you, you will certainly find out that the other pursuit is worse. That you're still just as susceptible to all the folly and accidents and brokenness of this world, and yet you will bring even more on yourself. So that's what I think is going on here. It is caution for you. Not to think that you can live rightly enough to correct a world that is broken. Not to think that you are capable of extreme perfect righteousness. You are not. You are human. You are limited. That's part of how we were made. But also not in that to harden our hearts and to run into evil. It's this promise. Wisdom will bring strength. Verse 19, wisdom makes the person stronger than 10 rulers of a city. Wisdom will bring strength even when outward suffering might make a mockery of what you call your strength. Just don't pay attention to everything that people say in verse 21. Don't pay attention to everything people say. You might hear a servant cursing you. For in your heart you know that many times you have yourself have cursed others. So he's calling out the fact that like people are not going to understand the way that you live. And he says that's okay because you don't understand the way people live either. I like love the stellar honesty of this verse, right? Don't listen too much, right? Don't listen to your coworkers. Don't listen to your children, because they're going to curse you if you listen too much. Like, if you're always listening to what they say about you, you're going to hear some negative things about you. And the reality, like, because don't you sometimes criticize others? Just be cautious in where you try and gather your idea of the quality of your life. All right, we got to wrap this up just a little bit more. Verse 23. I have tested all this by wisdom. I have resolved I will be wise, but it was beyond me. What exists is beyond reach and very deep. Who can discover it? I turned my thoughts to know, to explore, and examine wisdom and an explanation for things, and to know that wickedness is stupidity and folly is madness. And I find more bitter than death the woman who is a trap. Her heart a net and her hands chains. The one who pleases God will escape her, but the sinner will be captured by her. Look, says the teacher, I have discovered this by adding one thing to another to find out the explanation which my soul continually searches for but does not find. I found one person in 1,000, but none of those was a woman. Only this, I have discovered that God made people upright, but they pursued many schemes. You read this section, you're like, okay, after all this talk, we also have some misogyny. So really, like, layer on the details. Okay? This is an exciting Sunday for us, right? What's the author saying here? He says, wisdom from within is fleeting. He says, look, I've tried to pursue this. I've tried to learn everything I can learn. I've tried to find righteousness, but I just can't fully grasp it. He says, right, I've tested all this by wisdom. I've resolved to be wise, but it was beyond me. Oh, man, I feel that way sometimes. Like, man, I'm trying this. I'm trying to believe this. I'm trying to live like this. It just seems out of reach. It says, what exists is beyond reach and very deep. Who can discover it? I've turned my thoughts to try and know and explore, to examine wisdom, to try and find an explanation for things. I've tried to really know. I've tried to set in my heart that wickedness, that evil is stupid, that it hurts me. He says, I've tried this stuff, and I find it more bitter than death. Now he starts talking about these ladies, and you're like, why is he talking about these ladies? Okay, in Proverbs, if you read the book of Proverbs, we constantly have these comparisons between good and evil men and women. And it really is both sides. But one of the predominant storylines is that Proverbs is writing from a father to a son. And one of the things is he's trying to point his sons that read it to wisdom is he equates folly in the world to being pursued by a woman who's beautiful on the outside but who has ill intention for you. Okay, so he gives this negative example. And so what the author here of Ecclesiastes, the teacher, is saying, he's saying, I have found that. I have seen how folly, how stupidity, how pursuing foolish things can be alluring, can pull you in, and can bring ruin. He says, I've seen that. But then he says this, he says, look, I've looked through 1,000 things, I've looked through 1,000 people, and I haven't found even one woman, right? Which is whoa, really going through it here. Well, he's talking about another woman in Proverbs, I think. This is a tricky passage. I think as he's alluded to the woman of folly that is used in the book of Proverbs, now he alludes to the woman of wisdom found in Proverbs 31. This perfect, read it this week, and don't read it like a 1990s dating book, please, right? Don't read this and make your list for your spouse, and if you're a girl, you're but he'll be a man, and he'll have all that. No, okay? It's not trying to tell you about dating in the book of Proverbs. Chill out, right? It's trying to give you a picture, okay? So instead, read that as a picture, and read it as the personification of how wisdom could play out. But he says, man, I'm struggling to find it. He says, I found the folly, but I can't find this perfect depiction of wisdom depicted by this woman in Proverbs 31. And then he ends with kind of this melancholy statement, which maybe shouldn't be that surprising at this point. In 29, he says, only I see this. I've discovered God made people upright, but they pursued many schemes. He says, I've tasted the truth of wisdom. I've seen little good pieces of it, and I've seen the foolishness of pain. He says, I know for sure that folly, that stupidity, that selfish gain in this world, that the schemes of man, I know those are bad, but this life of wisdom does feel elusive. And so he resigns himself to this. He says, I know that God created people for something more. I know he created them good, and then they pursued a lot of different schemes. This is my conclusion when I try and figure out what the world is like in front of me, is that I know that what God says is true, but sometimes I don't feel it. I know that we've messed it up. Now, don't underplay the amount of faith that he has in even expressing some of those things, right? That even though he hasn't solved it, like even though he doesn't have an explanation for it, he doesn't decry God as the issue. Even though he acknowledges that God's in control of all things, he can see that ultimately there's some brokenness beyond him. But I think what is difficult as we read Ecclesiastes is it feels like the author's often a little bit stuck. Like it feels like, how do we find the resolution? And when we do this week in and week out, I think sometimes there's a tension here where it's like, where's the resolution to this? And that's why I think it's so interesting. Keeping in mind what we read at the beginning today, that first section of verses, I just want to compare that for you for just a moment to Jesus' words from the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. Here's what Jesus said. Matthew 5, starting at verse 3. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the humble, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Where the author of Ecclesiastes says all the same things, Jesus points out the same struggles and pain and then points you to a reality in which they are solved. Because Jesus, the Son of God, knows that the reward, that he knows that the end to pain, he knows that the final thing that will right everything that felt like toil, that was unably settled, the way that the paradox gets fixed is that where the teacher in Ecclesiastes can't see the future, Jesus knows of it. Where the author of Ecclesiastes feels stuck in the moment and can't work through how the world can exist in this way, can't find the clear path to the good life, Jesus comes and he teaches the same truth, but not as one afflicted, gazing up, asking why, but instead one who came to be afflicted that we might have true hope to right the wrongs in the world. And that's why Jesus can end this section of the Sermon on the Mount in 5, 11, and 12 saying this: you are blessed when they insult you and persecute you and falsely say every kind of evil against you because of me. Be glad and rejoice, because your reward is great in heaven. For that is how they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Jesus does not deny the reality that he, being the one who ultimately, like, he was the richest, right? Like, he possessed everything. Everything was set before him under his feet by the Father. He was the healthiest, right? Like, he had a body. He was in his prime. He was the wisest. He was extremely faithful. He was very moral, and yet he still would suffer. And so he, in that suffering and entering into this reality in which we live, now points to what we desperately need. Power beyond our suffering. Resurrection after pain. The reason I tell my kids it's okay, even when I'm not sure if it will be, is because I know as a parent that what I have to offer them in that moment is hope. Because as humans, I think we are incapable of making it okay unless we believe that it can be okay. And so, like, as a dad, when like they get a cut or a burn or when something breaks, even if I'm not sure it can be fixed, I'm telling them it's going to be okay. And that doesn't mean I can remedy the moment, right? But it means that I know I can be with them through the conclusion of how we deal with what went wrong. A parent offers this little bit of faith, but what God offers us in Jesus is not just hope of what might happen. is not just a better moment that might make this moment not as bad. He actually offers you a promise in which to trust. That no matter how sad it gets, no matter how broken it feels, that there's something beyond it. And so where the author of Ecclesiastes can only point and say, seems like it's just as good to be sad as it is to be happy. Seems like it doesn't matter if I'm rich or not. Seems like it doesn't matter if I'm healthy or sick. It seems like it doesn't matter if I'm famous. Everything just goes on and it all seems futile. Jesus can say, blessed are the poor in spirit, because the kingdom of heaven is theirs. He can both point and acknowledge the moment you're in, and he actually has the power and has offered you a solution for it in the future. And so as we close in prayer now, that's what we're going to pray. We're going to pray for the perspective that only Jesus can bring. We're going to pray that in our highest moments, we would hold them loosely, knowing they could be fleeting. And we're going to pray that in our worst moments, that our eyes would not be fixed and that our hope would not rest on the resolution of that moment, but our hope would rest in Jesus, who is beyond that moment, who wasn't surprised by that moment, and who has made provision for a perfect future with him in the kingdom. And those are hard things for us to realize. So let's pray and ask God to affirm them in our hearts. Lord, my faith is weak. Lord, when something simple goes wrong, I lose sight of you. And so, Lord, I beg of you that we would believe Jesus' words. God, I thank you for a passage that is hard, but that guides us to the feeling that reveals Jesus as the only solution. And so, God, whether this week was great or awful, whether this next week will be great or awful, God, whether our days will just feel mediocre and in between, no matter what our circumstance, will we not rest, Lord, in what we see, but will we rest in what you have promised to be true? God, help us when we can't believe it. Help us when the pain is more overwhelming than the hope. Lord, give us peace that we can't resolve the brokenness and crookedness of the world. But Lord, remind us of the hope that you have made it right and that we are hoping and waiting on that future with you. Lord, where you will wipe every tear from every eye. Where you will heal everything that ails us. God, where we will truly feel known, loved, and supported. God, where we'll have nothing to fix, have no one to impress. We'll just exist in joy with you. Lord, help us to hang on to that hope. God, seal it in our hearts and let us be champions of that truth to others who are longing for hope. Help us in this brokenness, Lord, to see you more than the mess in front of us. Lord, be with us, help us, and offer us peace. Thank you for Jesus, who has provided a hope and a kingdom that he has called us to be a part of. In him we pray. Amen. If you'd stand, we'll close in song.